Monday, June 25th, 2007. Fayetteville, Georgia. Medical personnel bring out 3 black body bags from a large mansion surrounded by police. A tragedy had occurred in that house. The world had lost a sports entertainment icon and his family. But the truth of what had gone on was far more shocking than anyone could have ever dared to think. Today, Descent into Darkness explores the meteoric rise and cataclysmic fall of a legend. But was he evil or damaged? Let us dive in to the Chris Benoit story. Early years. Christopher Michael Benoit was born on the 21st of May 1967 in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. From his very early days, Benoit, like many young lads, became enthralled by the world of professional wrestling. Now, I know what you're all going to say in the comments, that wrestling is all fake. And whilst, yes, the storylines are all scripted, known as kayfabe in the industry, and the outcomes of the matches are all predetermined, and all the moves are purposely designed to keep both athletes as safe as possible, however, accidents and even deliberate injuries still very much happen even today. So can we at least agree on that? Okay? Benoit's early hero was Tom Billington, but wrestling fans remember him better by his ring name as the Dynamite Kid. Like many Canadian wrestlers, Benoit would decide to take his wrestling training in Stu Hart's infamous wrestling school, known to all as The Dungeon. Or at least, that is the widely agreed upon story. Years later, Chris's own father, Michael, would claim that his son was in fact initially trained by Mike Hammer whilst he lived in Edmonton, and then later, after he moved to Calgary, by Angel Acevedo and Jerry Morrow, who were signed to Stu Hart's promotion at the time. Most likely the idea behind Benoit claiming that he was a product of Stu Hart's dungeon gym lent weight to his credentials as a performer, as the basement gym gained its nom de guerre from the regimen of being tough, no-nonsense, and those that made it through to the other side had really earned their stripes in every sense of the word. Whatever the reality, Benoit became a highly proficient technical style wrestler, with a flourish of high-risk maneuvers, which was then packaged in a tough, quiet, yet intimidating persona, very much modelled after his idol, Billington. Wrestling career. Once his training was complete, Stu Hart signed Benoit to his own promotion, Stampede Wrestling, from 1985 to 1989, making his debut on the 22nd of November 1985 in Calgary as part of a tag match. During his time with Stampede, Benoit would hold the tag team title 4 times, and their so-called British Commonwealth solo title 3 times, which in 4 years is quite the endorsement of faith in a star so new to the industry. From 1986 all the way through to 1999, Benoit would also wrestle for the highly prestigious New Japan Pro Wrestling, which at various times has played host to the likes of Hulk Hogan and Macho Man Randy Savage. Ooh, yeah. His first year would be spent in their developmental facility known as The Dojo, to hone his skills even further. He would initially wrestle under his own name with New Japan, but in 1989, as is so often the case for many wrestlers, the creative department decided to give him a gimmick. This one would have Benoit wearing a mask and came with the name change to the Pegasus Kid, which sounds absolutely shite, and Benoit himself admitted that he hated the gimmick, especially the mask, but he decided that he may as well embrace it. His time with New Japan would see him work some highly acclaimed matches with the likes of Jushin Thunder Liger, Black Tiger, El Samurai, and Shinjiro Otani. He would also gain the IWGP Junior Heavyweight belt. These would cement his reputation going forward. This newfound rep would see him offered a new opportunity back in North America in 1992 with the Ted Turner-owned promotion World Championship Wrestling, based in Atlanta. He would only wrestle there for a year before moving on to other pastures, most notably Extreme Championship Wrestling, or ECW, renowned for its harder-edge style. Benoit would then return to WCW in 1995, and it would be here that he would cement himself as a solid performer, particularly in their much-respected cruiserweight division that would become the promotion's main attraction, with stars such as Rey Mysterio Jr., Billy Kidman, Eddie and Chavo Guerrero, Dean Malenko, Chris Jericho, Raven, Conan, Perry Saturn, Psychosis, and La Parka. These men would all wow the crowds with not only their solid technical abilities but their high-flying athletic movesets that certainly always proved a huge draw for yours truly. Very quickly, WCW's Nitro show would grow to challenge Vince McMahon's WWF house show Raw is War, igniting the so-called Monday Night Wars. A war which so very nearly saw the WWF completely defeated, if not for the atrocious creative decisions that the writing team at WCW had begun to make towards the end of their existence. However, throughout this time, WCW widely did not fuck around too much with the cruiserweight division, and so the likes of Benoit and his aforementioned colleagues remained relatively unaffected by the shoddy storylines. Benoit would even get to work with stars higher up the card than the cruiserweights, feuding with Booker T, seeing the two men fighting over the promotion's television title belt, a second to third tier title that he would hold on 3 separate occasions. He would team up variously with Perry Saturn and Dean Malenko to secure the WCW tag team titles on 3 occasions. As part of his storyline in 1997, Benoit, who by this time had been brought into the 5th incarnation of the famous stable known as the Four Horsemen, led by the ever-charismatic Ric Flair, give me a woo in the comments, was paired with Nancy Sullivan as a manager, the wife of WCW booker Kevin Sullivan. Benoit was already married to a woman called Martina, and they had 2 children, David and Megan. However, the closeness of Chris and Nancy working together led to the two having an affair, which would ultimately cause the breakdown of both marriages. Chris and Nancy did marry, and they would go on to have a child together, a son named Daniel, born in November of 2000. But in 2003, Nancy filed for divorce, citing domestic abuse. She stated that Benoit was given to fits of extreme anger, throwing furniture and smashing objects. But things must have been patched up somehow, as she would drop the divorce and the two would remain living together. During his time with the promotion, Benoit would also win the US Championship twice and eventually graduate all the way up to the famous big gold belt of the brand-leading World Heavyweight Champion in 2000. However, by this time, Benoit was exceedingly unhappy with WCW, particularly with their booking managers who were in charge of deciding who faced who and decided to quit, along with close friends Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko and Perry Saturn, who all walked out of the company. With WCW now in shambles following a string of appallingly written storylines for their upper-card acts, most infamously the Finger Poke of Death, which was panned by pretty much everyone who saw it, the promotion began hemorrhaging money like a sieve, and very soon were forced to file for bankruptcy in the spring of 2001, eventually being bought out by everyone's favourite arsehole, Vince McMahon, who at around the same time also bought out ECW. From now on, the WWF, later rebranded the WWE after a dispute with the World Wildlife Fund, was the only major game in town, virtually holding a monopoly on sports entertainment wrestling. Thankfully, McMahon had the foresight to see the potential in bringing in several of WCW's former talent, Benoit being one of them. With the much greater exposure of the most popular wrestling brand in the world came huge opportunities for advancing his career. McMahon realizing that the Canadian, despite not being a gigantic tower of a man, as Vince usually preferred, was still more than capable of going the distance and becoming a top dog in the company. Once the rather disappointing missed opportunity that was the Invasion angle, where former WCW talent forming into a stable would square off against WWF's greatest, fizzled out, Benoit began to receive a solid push toward the top of the card. Even as soon as 2000, he had won the second-tier belt, the Intercontinental title, from Chris Jericho, which he would hold 3 times over the next year. His push would ultimately see him winning the 2004 Royal Rumble, and then going on to gain the WWF Heavyweight Championship belt in 2004 at WrestleMania 20, after forcing Triple H to tap out from a submission. He would later drop the belt in August to Randy Orton. Then he would go on to have a title run with the United States Championship belt up until 2007, when he would be transferred to the ECW brand that McMahon had kept going. The planned storyline was for Benoit eventually to win the ECW Championship from CM Punk, but sadly, this would never happen due to the awful real-life events that was to come. During his career, Benoit was known for two signature finisher moves, the first being a submission called the Crippler Crossface, and more importantly for this story, the Swan Dive Headbutt. In this, he would climb to the top rope and then, as the name would suggest, jump toward his prostrate opponent, connecting with his head. As you can imagine, this particular move brings with it a high likelihood of concussion. Whilst his showmanship was certainly lacking when it came to his charisma or skills on the mic, known in the industry as promos, his no-nonsense, brooding, tough man persona, coupled with his high-risk style, earned him the two nicknames, the Canadian Crippler and the Rabid Wolverine. The death of a close friend. It is largely accepted that the event that truly set Benoit on the downward spiral that would ultimately lead to the awful events of the 24th of 2007 was the untimely death of fellow wrestler Eddie Guerrero. Eddie Guerrero, aka Latino Heat, one of the most highly respected performers both in the ring and backstage, and utterly beloved by fans, was found dead by his cousin Chavo Guerrero in his Minneapolis hotel room on the 13th of November 2005, after failing to show up to that night's WWE live event. He was only 38 years old. The cause of death was ruled as acute heart failure. Eddie had suffered for many years with substance abuse, but by the time of his death had seemed to be making massive progress in his recovery, spurred on by the throngs of fans who would always cheer for him even when he was acting the part of the baddie. His signature cheeky grin right before he screwed someone over was all part of his readily likeable appeal. Upon hearing of Eddie's death, those that were with Benoit at the time stated that Chris let out a heart-wrenched guttural scream of grief and pain, tears flooding down his face. He was completely inconsolable for days afterwards. The next day on Monday Night Raw, the company dedicated the whole show to Eddie. The majority of the wrestling roster all gathered round the ring, and the mic passed round a number of them, who wished to say a few words of sorrow at Guerrero's passing. In an individual spot that was pre-taped and shown as part of the tribute, Benoit said a few words to his dear departed friend, saying how much he loved him and missed him and hoped he would one day see him again, before breaking down in tears. This was one of the most harrowing and mournful moments of the whole show. Tragedy. On Saturday the 23rd of June 2007, Chavo Guerrero, cousin of the ill-fated Eddie, along with Scott Armstrong, was driving down toward Laredo, Texas, as part of the so-called Texas Loop of shows. They intended to pick Benoit up from the airport. However, Benoit phoned Chavo and said that he would be unable to make it that night, as both Nancy and Daniel had food poisoning, and he was having to look after them both. Chavo, of course, expressed his dismay at the news and asked Chris if he was still going to be able to make the next night's Vengeance pay-per-view show. Benoit replied that he should be able to make that one. Before he rang off, Benoit said, "Hey Chavo, I love you, man." A little taken aback by the gesture, Chavo still reciprocated as one bro to another. He asked if Benoit was okay, but he reassured Chavo that he was just tired and said his goodbyes. When the call ended, Chavo was left with a quizzical look on his face. However, that night in the wee small hours, at around 0500, as Chavo lay asleep, he was awoken to the sound of his phone going off. It was a text from Chris, stating that the dogs were in the back, in the enclosed pool area, and that the back door was open. Less than a minute later, the exact same message came through, but from Nancy's phone. Then another message giving Chris his address. This highly puzzled Chavo, as he was supposed to be picking Chris up from the airport in around 3 hours' time. Why would he need to know any of that? Chavo, in his half-conscious state, thought little of the somewhat cryptic messages until the morning, when he asked Scott Armstrong over breakfast if he'd heard from Chris too. Armstrong said that he had received the same 2 messages, from both numbers. When Benoit uncharacteristically didn't show up for the pay-per-view on the 24th, and the following day's Raw show in Corpus Christi, Chavo and Armstrong approached Johnny Ace, the head of WWE's Talent Relations Department, and told him of the odd call and messages from Benoit. Worried that something was amiss, Ace quickly consulted with Vince McMahon and then phoned the Fayetteville Police Department and asked them to conduct a welfare check on the family. Around 14:30 in the afternoon of the 25th, Lieutenant Larry Alden of the Fayette County Sheriff's Department was tasked with the welfare check. Upon arrival to the property, he was greeted by the next-door neighbor and the sound of the Benoit family's 2 dogs barking incessantly. The neighbor assured Lieutenant Alden that the dogs were friendly and that she often fed them when Benoits were away. She agreed to attempt to go inside and check on the family, but soon after gaining entry to the house, she ran back out screaming in horror that little Daniel was dead. Alden immediately called for backup and then went into the house himself, where he found an horrific sight. All 3 members of the Benoit family were dead. Early rumours abound that a home invasion had occurred and that all 3 had been killed in the commission of that crime, but this was quickly dispelled when the evidence of the scene was picked through. A much darker picture formed, and the conclusion was reached. Whilst it is impossible to know exactly what went on in the Benoit household, it is widely surmised by the subsequent investigators that, over a 3-day period, Chris had tied up and killed his wife Nancy, and then drugged his 7-year-old son Daniel before killing him also, both dying of strangulation. He finally ended his own life by hanging himself from one of his weight training machines. Aftermath, medical findings, and mysterious Wikipedia edits. Several strange occurrences took place around everyone's favourite internet whipping boy, Wikipedia. Chris Benoit's own page was subject to a few highly questionable edits in the hours just before and just after the discovery of the bodies at the house. Around 14 hours before the Benoit household was searched, an anonymous user edited the page to say that the reason for Chris's no-show at the WWE event was due to the sudden death of Nancy. This was removed by another user due to the lack of a citation for such a bold statement. However, another user reinserted the edit only an hour later and attributed it to various discussion forums. This again was removed, and the edits reported to a site admin. After the truth of what had happened became public knowledge, it was later rumoured on by broadcaster Bill O'Reilly and his guest Geraldo Rivera that perhaps the anonymous user could have been Benoit himself, hoping to allay any suspicion. Although, given the medical findings, which we shall discuss in a bit, I don't think that this is very likely. A regular contributor to Wikipedia with the username Sir Fozzie commented, "If you look at the IP's other edits, it's pretty obvious that this was just a garden-variety vandal whose vandalization sadly proved true." When WWE learned of the death of Benoit and his family, they quickly gathered the performers around the ring where Vince addressed them and told them of the awful news. This prompted Vicky Guerrero, Eddie's widow, to erupt in a howling scream at another tragedy so close to the one she had already suffered 18 months before. She had to be helped away to calm her down by Benoit's old friend and colleague Dean Malenko. The early news rumoured that the tragedy was the result of a home invasion, which led to the company quickly organising a tribute service for him, like how they had done for Eddie. A special supercut of all of his greatest matches and interviews with various wrestlers and promoters was shown on a huge screen that covers the entranceway, known as the Titantron. However, soon after this event was held, the shocking truth came to light, and as they so often do, WWE were very quick off the mark to erase all mention of Benoit from their website and promotional materials, including the tribute segment. The very next episode of Raw, the day after the tribute, Vince McMahon would begin the broadcast by personally issuing a statement.
On a recent edition of Raw, the WWE presented a special tribute show recognizing the career of Chris Benoit. However, the facts of this horrific tragedy involving Chris Benoit were not known at the time. Therefore, other than my comments, there will be no mention of Mr. Benoit's name in this program. On the contrary, this show is dedicated to everyone who has been affected by this terrible incident. This marks the first step of the healing process whereby WWE performers will now do what they do better than anyone else in the world: entertain you.
Upon examination, Benoit's body was found to have over 10 times the normal level of testosterone, along with other drugs such as nandrolone and anastrozole, which is actually a breast cancer drug, but is known to be used by the bodybuilding community to counteract estrogen. On top of this, he was found to have testicular failure, meaning that he was no longer producing testosterone naturally. Nancy's body was found to contain the drugs Xanax, hydrocodone, and hydromorphine, but the levels were judged to be the same as someone who was prescribed these substances, rather than the higher levels usually found in addicts or suicide attempts. However, Xanax, a fast-acting tranquilizer, was also found in wee Daniel's body, leading to the conclusion that he had been sedated before Benoit murdered him. A lot of people have put Chris Benoit's behaviour down to so-called roid rage, a drastic change in mood that can manifest very violently. However, as someone who has been a gym bro in the past, although you wouldn't know it to look at me, and knows quite a few people who have been on the gear, it is worth pointing out that roid rage really only comes out when you haven't been feeding yourself properly. Think of it more like an extreme version of being hangry, simultaneously hungry and angry. It is not something that just occurs randomly out of nowhere just because you're on the juice. The investigation also concluded that it was not a factor in the tragedy. WWE had introduced a wellness program in the previous year in response to the untimely passing of wrestlers past and present. This program offered help to any current or former employee who was suffering health problems as a result of their time in the business. The wellness program also monitored wrestlers for their levels of performance-enhancing drugs, but when one considers just how jacked a lot of these wrestlers are, there is no way that they are not on the gear. Benoit had defied the policy and had illegally obtained the steroids that were found in his system. The most alarming finding of the autopsy was found when they opened up Chris's skull and found overwhelming evidence of a condition called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. 2 decades of performing his famous finisher swan dive headbutt move and other countless knocks left Benoit's brain mushed beyond belief, with multiple concussions, far beyond even American football players, themselves infamous for brain injuries, and they wear helmets. The brain examination conducted by Julian Bales, the head of neurosurgery at the University of West Virginia, stated that Benoit had the brain of an 85-year-old dementia patient. Perhaps this led Chris to not even recognizing his family anymore. Sadly, it is impossible to tell, as the only person who knows can't tell us. Legacy. I must admit to being a bit of a wrestling fanboy for many years now. The Monday Night Wars were a fascinating time, and I was firmly on Team WCW until their writing got sloppy beyond belief. WWF's Attitude Era also produced some of the most exciting entertainment that I ever saw. And of course, despite all those warnings, my friends and I absolutely did try those things at home. Don't tell me what to do. I remember Chris Benoit as being one of my favourites, but the awful tragedy most definitely cast a dark shadow over his career legacy. His over-the-top abuse of steroids and other performance-enhancing substances was almost certainly a contributing factor into what had happened, and that is entirely on him. What is not his fault, however, is the catastrophic brain damage that he had suffered for all those years of constant trauma. But does that negate what he did? WWE have taken every effort to remove every single reference to Benoit, and his name is never to be mentioned ever again by anyone on camera or online, practically erasing him from existence to an almost Soviet level. Greater awareness of CTE and other traumas have also led the company to introduce new rules banning chair shots to the head and moves that involve potentially dropping someone onto their head. WWE have also been shit hot at protecting their brand image, so you can understand why they wish to distance themselves from Benoit. It is undoubtable that Chris Benoit's actions were completely inexcusable, and his wife and son paid the ultimate price for the constant abuse that Chris put his body through. But the point that will remain under constant scrutiny for many years of future debate is just how culpable was he in those moments. I think veteran promoter Paul Heyman said it best in his inimitable no fucks given style.
You can admire his work all you want, but I'll give you my take on it. 3 people died in that house that night. 3 people died in that house that night. Only one person had the choice behind it. So if that's your boy, fuck you. As a performer, amongst the 5 greatest I've ever seen in my entire life. As a human being, I don't care about CTE. I don't care what the reasons are. Nancy and Daniel had no option. He did. Fuck him.
Thank you for watching this video. I do hope you found it informative and interesting. If you did, please click the old like button and consider sharing it with a friend. Professional wrestling is no stranger to tragedy. Would you like to hear more in the future? Let me know in the comments. Do you think Chris was evil or damaged? There are certainly arguments for both sides. Again, let me hear your take. Check out my back catalogue for more great videos just like this one. If you wish to do so, you can support DID on Patreon, link in the description, or via the Super Thanks button if you'd like to make a one-off donation. Or if you wish to keep your donations in-house, I've also started channel memberships at the same price as the Patreon memberships at a mere $2.99 a month. A huge thank you to my current patrons who are pivotal in keeping this channel alive. And if you simply can't resist my smooth, buttery voice, you can head on over to my alternate channel DID Reads to hear even more eloquently narrated content. And in the meantime, take care of yourself, and I shall see you on our next descent into darkness.